All right, guys. So in this part of our lecture, we're going to continue to give an historical overview of how Latin America came to be. All right. So once different groups begin to get their independence from the Spanish. The Spanish did in Spanish as in Spain, as in over in Europe. They were forming more of a foothold here in the Americas. These colonies that were being shaped revolution, there in the 1800s. Revolution was the name of the game. You have the French Revolution, we have the American Revolution. This helped spark off revolutions in Latin America and the Caribbeans. Like I said, a lot of slave rebellions. And so as they're starting to form their own nations, of course, just like with America and its early formation, they're trying, everybody's trying to figure out what type of society and government you want to form. So we see a little modeling of American government in that we have those three branches of government, but political participation was limited, which is not unique because, once again, even in the beginning of an American government, it was of the people for the people, but the founders of the United States were really hesitant on just how much power they wanted to give the people. So, we kind of see the same things going on here. We see the same kind of political ideologies and groups being formed. You have these federalists and centralists. You have the liberals and the conservatives. So those are all just fancy ways of saying that people were grouping off. People were segregating themselves into their own groups and forming these political associations and agendas that were going to further their own self interest. And of course, the more elite groups in society wanted to maintain their power and control, as once again typical human nature, I do believe, typical how any culture is set up. People at the top want to stay at the top. Most of us are just trying not to go any lower, right? And so we see the same thing here. So, the groups at the top, they really don't trust those lower class groups. And like I said, just basic psychology because of fear. They're afraid of the groups rebelling and overtaking them and then taking all their stuff. And then we also have regionalism. So we have issues there. And we see a lot of civil wars going on, and a lot of the Central Americans, they're fighting and they're struggling against each other because regionalism is everybody's trying to carve out their own little spot of the land now, their piece on the map to say, okay, this is ours, these are our people, these are our resources. So we've got to come up with our own government and then, figure out how we interact with the rest of the world, right? All right. And so when it comes to regionalism in Brazil and Chile, we see the regional leaders, they were never basically this is all these points are just related to the fact that when it came to regionalism in these two countries that and really it really played a role in Brazil's political faith there. And you gotta say I kind of had a little brain fart and forgot some of my notes on that one right there. So what we see with all this regionalism There's a lot of wars going on between the different Latin American nations. And then, of course, Mexico is kind of in a unique position because it's the first one that the now newly formed states is encountering. And once the American Revolution happened, the United States was really interested with acquiring more land and pushing west. And so, that had a lot of horrible consequences for the Native Americans. And then we have to remember that a good part of the Southwest and the western part of the United States was Mexico at this time. It was Mexico before, and then when the Spanish, they're the ones that are credited discovering a lot of the Southwest and the indigenous tribes and communities that live there. So by the time we get to America's independence and their lust for more land and resources, there's starting to be a lot of friction between them and Mexico. And, Texas was really that was like the defining moment for the Mexican American War. All had to do with and yeah, that is actually one of the reasons, Texas and its annexation and, the United States gaining it from Mexico. A lot of that had to do with slavery. The colonies in the southern part of the United States wanted more land because they needed to, make more money off of agriculture. So they needed more slaves. And then the colonies in the northern part of the United States, they had their fears over westward expansion because they did not want any more slaves. And so, that, like I said, that caused a lot of problems for Mexico, which ended in a war in the southwestern part of the United States being succeeded to the United States. So, the land Mexico had to give that to the Brazil. I had a lot of rebellions, a lot of struggles between those liberals and conservative. And, when you're in these constant states of warfare, that really creates a militarized society, that's really just going to, any little thing is going to exacerbate those wounds. It's like a festering sore, and just anything's going to make the scab fall off, and it start to bleed again. So, lots of tension and war going on. In many ways, this is, these wars that were going on in the past and these decisions to become these type of more militaristic type governments really define the way Latin America has been moving forward. And they've had the same problems modernizing as pretty much anybody else. And when we get to the Cold War and we see the way that these Latin American nations were used by both the United States and the Soviet Union, it makes it a little easier to see why now in 2020, the 21st century, there's still these problems with drugs and human trafficking and poverty down, in our southern of the United States. They're below our southern border, and that then helps explain a little bit more about the immigration problems that we have. There's still a lot of hurt and healing that is going on in this part of the world. I think though we can say that pretty much for all of us. There's a lot of hurt and healing going on in the world in general, and it would behoove all of us to try to find those more positive, productive, and efficient ways with each other. So, and in speaking, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell. So, all right. So on this slide, just looking at some of those. So, like I said, during this time, trying to form their independence, we see this regionalism. So everybody's trying to, chart out their own little spot on the map, to form their nations. And so just with this map, we see the beginning of those nation states, how they are formed, and then we see those present day boundary markers. And then, as I was talking about the Mexican American War and that land that was lost, this is pretty much what we see in this map. It's just the territory that Mexico lost to the United States. And interesting to see how far down into Central America that was fought, because we see even down there in what is I think Mexico City's there anymore. I could be wrong though, but we see down there Tampico, which the United States captured. All right, and so going back to this idea of how do you form a government? What's the political? I guess you could say like a constitution, or those political rules of how the government, the people in charge of the nation, are going to go about governing the people that they're governing, right? And so popular participation, of course, that just has to do with getting the people involved in the politics, and, getting support for whatever your agenda is and how you want the nation to go. That would be the leaders of it, right? And a lot of the issues when it came to nation building in Latin America had to do with food and employment, which once again, we still see a lot of that in modern day Latin America, just, poverty and high unemployment rates. And of course, when it came to the economic stability of a lot of these nations, those lower classes were the ones that were, the most oppressed. So getting their support, they're the most suppressed, they're the biggest group, getting their support in your political agenda was, just a way to get more, it was going to give you more power and control. And then, of course, once again, we see those fears with the upper class because, they're maybe losing some of their power and control. And so we see a new type of leadership emerging in Latin America. And so we see Cadillos, I think might be how you say that, Cayudillos, something to that effect. And so basically, these were, you can kind of look at, these were middlemen. So they're pretty much somebody who was of mixed race. And, they were like these middlemen. They were trying to bridge that gap between the upper and the lower classes. And Juan Manuel de Rosso was an important figure at this time, because he kind of, he was a little successful in being able to achieve that at the time. So, start bringing people together. And of course, when it comes to building your own nation, like I said, revolution, what was the name of the game here at the end of the 17th, 18th centuries, probably the 18th century, before we started modernizing. Everybody had to rebel against this colonial slave system. And then once you do that, how then do you rebuild your economy? How now do you start making your livelihood? Like I said, Caribbeans and Latin America was already um, presenting itself to the rest of the world as a major economic, export area, meaning that they had a lot of products that were in demand around the world, things like sugar, especially things like coffee. Those are, came here from Latin America. It's pretty interesting. I was listening to a radio show the other day, and they were talking about how even as far into, oh man, I can't remember. I want to say, I do want to say it was something like in an ancient, not Egyptian, more like Persian. They were talking more about like Persian culture, so Middle Eastern cultures, and how they had cocaine, like when they found the tomb of this emperor and opened it, that there was actual cocaine, and that is not grown anywhere else in the world except for in Latin America. Except for in Latin America. And I just found that interesting because I was like, you have these ideas that Columbus did not discover America, already living here. Then there's a lot of archaeological evidence that suggests even before Columbus, that people knew that there was land over here and cultures were in contact with each other. And I think that kind of makes sense because I don't think that Spain would have given him so much money and so many resources to try to get to India way if there wasn't some kind of rumor of land, maybe of there being some kind of land here. So those export products and commodities that were coming from Latin America were in high demand. That was a good thing for these new forming nation states of Latin America, because they had a way to go about generating money. It's just because it was built on slavery, they had to figure out how to rebuild that system, because they had the revolutions. Like I mentioned, the Haitian Revolution was the one that really they heard about, American Revolution, and Haiti's not that far from America, so I'm sure that news traveled a lot quicker between those places than say it did the rest of Latin America because of limited travel networks at the time. And it just took longer to, longer and limited travel networks. But once those revolutions started there in Haiti, it just sparked off, and the Caribbeans, they were very all the Caribbean islands were very successful in liberating themselves. And so, like I said, so this created a new type of problem because they had to keep these exports going, but they had to find a new way to do it. And so we see this pattern of boom and bust emerge. And once again, I don't think that means anything other than, when you're young and you're trying to develop your nations, then you're going to go through these changes of uncertainty and these changes of fluctuation as you're adapting to those changes. And I don't think it's something that can happen overnight. It is like, like the slide just said, it's this pattern of these ups and downs, because you got to work out all the kinks to figure it out before you can get that stability and kind of normalize things. And so geography also posed a problem in nation building when it comes to the importing and the exporting of these products, because you see, they had to get back to Europe. So of course during this time, it guaranteeing that your ship was actually going to make it was an uncertainty. And then looking at our map here, we see it's not necessarily that these nations are landlocked here in the Caribbean Sea, but they're definitely, just by looking at this map of the Caribbean Sea in Central America, we see some of those challenges of of these different countries being able to get their products where they need it to go. And, it goes down to space, because what's Venezuela down here on the main continent had to go and get out there by the port of Trinidad, by Trinidad. Wait, Trinidad is that's part of Venezuela. Let me go up some. Okay, so they go up and they want to go up and go past Puerto Rico. Well, now they're in Puerto Rico's water space and airspace, and what does Puerto Rico get for felicitating that trade agreement because they're allowing Venezuela to go. This is the main this is why we see World War I starting. Russia was locked from being able to use, those waterways to get products in and out of the country. And so there in the Balkans, especially, was a main trade route that Russia wanted to keep secure. And then there are just a lot of other things that were going on that caused World War I too. But that trade routes, these trade routes are what connected us as a global world, to begin with. And so now that we had them, whose were they? Who did they belong to? Who had the right to send their ships here to get their products over there? And if you, Puerto Rico, are the middleman, you get nothing out of that transaction. So we can see how, all of these ideas were what were going on. And so everybody's trying to work it out with each other. At the same time, they're trying to, get that solidarity within their own people. And so, of course, by this time, as we talked about in our first lecture, all those different cultures that came together to start building Latin America, by the time we get to the 1800s, and then, of course, the beginning of the 20th century, we see a very ethnically diverse population. And we still see that colonial heritage, though, in a lot of those larger cities that existed. All right, so when it came to the economic everyday life for most people, we see these large estates, haciendas. Oh, I'm probably gonna butcher this one too. Estanisas, plantations, and fazendas. For most people, that's what it was. You had this. It was a one family in charge of this specific piece of land, and most of the employees, they worked long, hard hours. So once again, we're out of the slave system, so now we're in a system of some kind of sharecropping or tenant farming. And it's a type of indentured servitude. So you agree to work for somebody else, and you get a piece of it. So with sharecropping, what they would do is basically they would have the employee. It was really just slavery with the new name. Okay, so they would have these employees and they would make them work, and then when it came time for harvesting of those crops, they, it was like everybody was, all those estate employees were in debt to the estate owner, because in order to work, people still had to eat, they still had to have places to live. So the owners would set up these systems, be like, okay, well, it's a credit system. You come to the store and you buy your food and whatever you need for your family, and we're just put it on the books. We'll put it on your debt. So come harvest time, we'll just take that out of your cut. Well, pretty much those owners would gouge the people and keep them in the share tenant cropping system, because come harvest time, when you showed up to get your part of, to get your money for what you have worked, the landowner will pull out his books and be like, "Oh, sorry, you made this much, but your debt for everything you bought is this much, and unfortunately, you're in the negative. So keep working because you already owe me next year's harvest." And that was something that they did in the southern United States too. And that was one of the reasons, even after slavery had been abolished and even after Reconstruction, we still see so many poor areas in the South. And then, of course, not we have to remember that we're just getting a general overview here of what the sharecropper tenant system was. Not everybody was a mean person. There were many of those estate owners that a lot of those you know of those systems that were very fair and gracious to the people working for them. And then when it came to domestic life, we once again, as the world is changing, of course, the social and cultural conditions are changing for people too. And just like in the beginning of the 20th century, here in the United States, we have industrialization, we have the beginning of modernization, that hits Latin America, America, the Caribbeans too. And so we start to see a different differences in the way domestic life. So, of course, there's still that stark difference between the rich and the poor, but we see women stepping up in society. Well, not quite just yet. We're still kind of women are more the domestic side of it. But as we have more of these slave rebellions, as we have more industrialization, modernization, we start to see women moving themselves up in society, especially when it comes to Mexican culture and history. And then, as we said, before we had revolution, there were still these plantations. And so the life of slaves was very, very hard. And we especially see that in Brazil. You remember I forgot some of my notes on Brazil and Chile there, but we did talk about how the Civil War that they were having in Brazil. It's very harsh, and it had just to do with with these conditions and just the environment in general. And then, even though we see these stark differences between the rich and the poor in Latin America at this time, and that rich people, once again, they have these large plantations, the majority of people, they lived in small villages. Once industrialization came, then people were kind of, this is where, just like here in North America, you see the idea of people renting out rooms and having tenants. And, that's kind of where like the early, just rental, people renting apartments comes into play. But it's also important that whenever we study history or whenever we look at any culture, really, I was going to say when we look at different cultures, but it's important even when we look at our own cultures that we don't idolize or try to romanticize them. As cool as looking around the world of what we do as human beings can be, we got to stay practical too. So, all and it's about maintaining an unbiased attitude too. So, we live in a culture to where a lot of what, in the United States, a lot of what we know about other cultures has already been idealized for us in media, movies and stories and books and stuff. And so I think when we think about Latin American Hispanic culture, you think of, people living in the little towns and they're really, these small little villages out in the middle of nowhere and, very poor and not a lot of people. And I mean, yeah, there's some of that no matter where you go in the world. But, once again, we want to not romanticize the past. We don't want to be biased when we look at other cultures. We're just trying to learn and understand because I really think when we go and we start taking an historical perspective and looking at the different cultures that we have today, like I said, it's just really easy to see why we still have a lot of conflict and problems in the world today. And I really think it's because we think we're so advanced and so smart as modern societies, but we're so new to all this modern type of living stuff. So in many ways, we're still very much babies, and we still see all this conflict because we're all still in some type of nation building phase, especially, like I said, industrialization, World War I, World War II, the Cold War. These events are not that, or they're not so far in the past that they're still not affecting us, are still affecting us, and even us in America, and smart and advanced than the rest of the world. We still have a lot of learning and growing too. So when it came to the more of the lower classes, of course, protecting their individual and collective land holding, not having, not being gouged with taxes, just having their right just to live their lives without a lot of government interference. That those were important questions when it came to these nations building their government. And then, for most people anywhere in the world at this time, I would say life was just about working your land and being with your family. And, there were time to, like I said, women were becoming more plentiful, I guess you can say, in society. And so therefore their position in society stepping up. And then once again, if you didn't become a nun and go live in a convent, if you didn't get married, then you still went out and worked as a woman and still had responsibilities and obligations, especially when it comes to more of the poor population, because it goes back to those tenets of talked about earlier, is that everybody has to play their part and do their role to keep the society going. That's the same thing with the family, right? And because of that influence of Catholicism, we do see that religion is a huge part of rural Latin American life, and it permeates popular culture, and that's even true today. And I think it's funny that Catholicism, though, is so strong, yet there seems to be this statistic that most people who live in rural areas, they've never even seen a priest. So I find that interesting. Or from. And then, like I said, we're starting to get into industrialization. And so, across the globe, pretty much is this pull of this call for people to start living more of an urban lifestyle. So we see people all over the world flocking, and especially people moving from Europe to the Americas. And so we see a lot of big cities being built. And of course, when you build a city and you're trying to accommodate all these people, a lot of city planning and geography goes into that. And in the beginning days of building all of that, cities were disgusting. Beginning of industrialization, houses were built on top of each other. You can really see it in parts of like New England and in the northern part of the United States. You see, houses are really, really close together, trying to utilize the most space. There was no electricity. They didn't even have indoor plumbing at this time, which means that there were no sewer systems, walking, and human and animal species. That actually, guys, fun historical fact, that is how high heels invented, because the rich people didn't want to go down to walk through the streets of London, but wading through the human and animal feces. And so someone got the bright idea to make these, platform, expanded, higher shoes, that I guess because it kept you farther from the ground so you can look down your nose at all people help. But that really is true. That's my my crazy interpretation of that historical fact, but that is how I feel platform shoes in in it. And so when it came to building these cities, like I said, there were a lot of problems, a lot of disease, and it mostly just sanitation. And then, of course, in the beginning, businesses it was that you would think of as mom and pop type shops. It's these small businesses. They had the goods that people made, and it's very much these family owned enterprises. And that's why we see cities being so ethnically and culturally diverse, is because you have people from all parts of Europe were coming together. So here in Latin America, we see more of probably Europeans, definitely Portuguese and Spanish, more than were coming to Latin America. But you also see people from other parts of Latin America moving, and Mexico City still is actually it's one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. It was a very beautiful city. Before that, it was the Mayans, I believe. They had these beautiful temples around there, and so Mexico City. I've never been there, but it's actually quite impressive. Like to go visit. Interestingly, though, they're having a lot of problems right now because of global warming, and it comes to the infrastructure and kind of the architecture of how Mexico City is built, and it has to do with water, about the way I heard it on NPR. It's been a couple years ago, but it has to do with the way the water is flowing in the city. It's like they're just not getting enough of that, or there's too much to where like it must be there's too much or something, but it's causing problems with the roads, and I think that there's going to be some like structural damage, just global warming too. It has to do with when you start really recognizing areas and you're taking away the natural you're disturbing the natural ecological system that really is cause a lot of havoc in the form of water. So here in Tennessee, even down in places like Alabama, where I did a lot of archaeology, looking at the landforms and looking at where your water source was and how you avoid the water source plays a big role in how anybody, even in the ancient civilizations, set up their cities. And so when with modernization and urbanization, a lot of that we just build on top of those old cities. But because of expansion and you're expanding out into these other areas, you're disrupting the ecological systems. And what's that does is it creates a lot of soil erosion. When you don't have the grass with all its roots keeping the soil in, soaking up the water, that just creates a lot of runoff problems. And then you see either you have a lot of flooding, or you have things like a lot of sinkholes. Maybe that's what it is with the city. There's this giant sinkhole, that's something to where they've got a lot of problems with erosion and water. So interesting fact there. And as I said, the more that we see Latin American modernizing, especially when it comes to Mexico, life really starts changing for women, and they really, are starting to exert themselves as a force of society, and just really changing the way life and society goes, especially when it comes to city living, because we see with Mexico America that most of the women that moved from that most of the people that moved from the countryside were women. And then pretty much all the women that a quarter of all women in Mexico City, they work. So that was a third of the workforce. And then in de Janeiro by 1870, we see that over 50% of the workforce are free women, and in those, there were 88% of slave women working. So the freed slaves, so women, at this, at the beginning of modernization, were really shaping and forming urban living. And because of that, of course, these women did not conform to those traditional patriarchal type of ideas. And we also see that on average, women were having 5 children at the most in their lifetime. And, once again, that probably wasn't much different for women living in other cities in America at this time. You got to remember there were of control, like all cultures have some natural control that they use, but then, at the same time, in the beginning, with the beginning of life, living, especially, the type societies, we do see in the 19th and 20th century, women seem to have more than, average women, 1, 2 children at the most. And because of patriarchy, a lot of times marriages were very unequal. Now, of course, when it came to, food, clothing, shelter, entertainment, you see the main staple of most Latin American diets. And, it was middle class, it was modest, it was precious. And then when it comes to the more wealthy side of culture, food was very plentiful. Meals were very leisurely, whereas, probably poorer parts of population were a little more conservative with their food, just like we see with the rest. So when they're, striking difference in clothing styles of the affluent and the poor, and few Mexicans, they can afford those really fine silk, that really pretty war, and so most of the population, had very simple, practical clothing. And I think we still see that in some of the clothing dress, especially like I mentioned, like at Carnival, if you ever watch the footages of that, you see, that those really be silk and like types of clothes have come up. Then up came, like I said, at this time, it was as immigrants coming into cities, they were overcrowded. Or you see, out rooms in their house and kind of the beginning of, just modern day apartment complex, or couldn't really, they could not afford the rent. And so in bigger cities, kind of, sadly, conditions are probably not much better in many areas than they were beginning of the 19th century. So when it came to entertainment, life was really miserable. But, as humans, we endure, we find ways to enjoy. We find ways to make out of the situation. And with urbanization, these mass migrations of people to cities, it did change the way people live. And, it did set up this called in some way to become popular in Latin America. entertainment in the form of drinking, gambling, and then all right, guys. So that wraps lectures this. We're looking into just being in, Latin American culture, Central America, and just getting that brief historical view of what these cultures and nations have undergone. Since when Columbus first stepped foot in the Caribbeans to the beginning of modernization there. So all right, guys, thanks so much for joining me. I will see you in the discussions. As always, please feel free to reach out for anything.